Hello, everyone. My name is Dolf Gielen. I'm the hydrogen lead in the World Bank ESMAP program. We are very happy today to hear the insights from a new IFC report called Unlocking Opportunities Green Hydrogen in Emerging Markets. And that is a product which was developed in cooperation with ESMAP. It's for us a very timely report because together with our colleagues in IFC, we, and also with MIGA, Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, we have started a 10 gigawatt lighthouse initiative to promote the deployment of green hydrogen in emerging markets and developing countries. And in that context, we're currently assessing the project pipeline and looking what are now exactly the barriers to bring these projects forward and what can be done to overcome these barriers. And of course, that is exactly the topic of this new analysis. So it will certainly inform that body of work which we're doing together with 15 other development financing institutions. So with the agenda today is we will hear the presentation and then we have a Q&A. We have reserved 1.5 hours for it, but perhaps we can close it in a shorter time. Let's see. And we have two excellent IFC speakers with us today. We will hear from Margaret Monnier, who is Operations Officer in the Climate Business Department at the International Finance Corporation, where she deals with industrial decarbonization with green hydrogen and a number of other emerging technologies, renewable emerging technologies. And we will hear from Ignacio de Calonge, who is Principal Investment Officer for Oil, Gas and Mining in IFC. And in that context, he's also one of the leads for the hydrogen work in IFC. So Margaret and Ignacio, very welcome. And I give the floor to you for your presentation, please.
Thanks, Dolf. I'll hand it over to Margaret. Just to clarify, I am no longer oil and gas, and that used to be my past life. So energy now, but no, super happy to be here. And thanks, Dolf and Ignacio for inviting us. And I think we're excited to present this report and maybe then also discuss a bit more broader, what we're doing as IFC, in this space. I think, the hydrogen space is a really exciting one. As we all know, it has its ups and downs, and it's constantly evolving. And so there is no single report which will be able to constantly be up to date with the ever-changing market. But this report hopefully gives a good image of a point in time in the hydrogen journey and a bit of the lessons learned to date. But Margaret, you have been a key writer of the report and author of the report, and so over to you.
Thanks Ignacio. Thanks, Dolf. Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Let me try to share my screen and it works. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Margaret Monnier, and I'm pleased to present the findings of the reports that Dolf had referenced. But for those of you that haven't had the chance to read the report, if you just open your phone and open the camera, just scan the QR code right here on the left, it will take you directly to the report, and you can just have it handy on your phone. So just as a quick background, at the time we had put this research report together, it was clear at that point, and this was like 2 years ago, over 2 years ago when we started working on the report, it was clear that we had to transition to cleaner energy systems, but the question was how. At the time, there are so many technologies on the table, but one that stands out for its potential to decarbonize some of the most difficult, hard to abate sector is green hydrogen. So we thought, okay, let's put together a report on green hydrogen. The report essentially explores how stakeholders, and that's developers, investors, and policymakers, how they can come together to unlock the full potential of green hydrogen and also ultimately attract financing from the private sector. We hope that this report is going to give you a clear framework to guide this effort and also create high development impacts from new industries, generating high quality jobs, and also strengthen the resilience of countries in the face of global challenges. Now, this report builds on prior World Bank Group reports, and the first one is, which I'm sure most of you must have read, is green hydrogen in developing countries. The second one is on scaling hydrogen financing for development. So this report that we're going to talk about actually incorporates recent observations based on our experience. Now, although the report is centered on emerging markets, in some instances, we've leveraged data and case studies from developed economies because they're still the leading indicators of what to expect. And from the case studies in developed economies, we drew conclusions for the emerging markets. Now, question is, why did we focus on emerging markets? That's because we feel emerging markets have a unique opportunity to become key players in the global low-emission hydrogen economy. Emerging markets, especially those that have abundant, low-cost renewable energy resources, as well as advanced industrial sectors, can leverage green hydrogen production to strengthen their domestic economies. Now, this approach will not only help them to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors, but would also enhance economic resilience by reducing exposure to macroeconomic shocks. Now, before going into the report itself, we thought we should lay the land on the general uptake challenges with green hydrogen. While we recognize that emerging markets have a unique chance to lead in the global green hydrogen economy, we also have to recognize that this potential is not without its challenges. Many of the emerging economies face real barriers to scaling green hydrogen. And at the time we had put this report together, some of the challenges that were prominent and we've highlighted in the report includes, one, the cost of producing green hydrogen. At the time the report was prepared, green hydrogen production cost was 4 to 6 times the price of gray hydrogen. And gray hydrogen is basically hydrogen from reforming natural gas. Second challenge was little or no offtake because of the high price and also concerns around guaranteed supply. Third challenge was supply chain disruptions, lack of financing, infrastructure gaps, and more recently, the elevated policy risks. So you've heard about potential changes in the US IRA, the EU CBAM, as well as geopolitical tensions. Now, we hope that this report will provide the framework that stakeholders will use to navigate the opportunities as well as the challenges. And we've also tried to outline practical steps required to translate this ambition to action, and hopefully would unlock the green hydrogen potential in emerging markets. So the report is very short. It's just 5 chapters. We would only focus on 3 of the chapters in this presentation. But just generally, the first chapter, when you read it, gives an overview of the hydrogen sector, the technology, market size, existing uses and projections of green hydrogen production. On the market size, for example, we had estimated that the global hydrogen market will exceed 300 billion by 2030, with a share of green hydrogen projected to be about 30 billion. Now, the core of the report, which is chapter 2, 3, 4, touches on the barriers to scaling hydrogen in emerging markets, while 3 and 4 will look at market readiness as well as project suitability criteria, which will serve as decision-making filters in order to guide stakeholders towards scalable, high-impact opportunities. Yeah. So just quickly touching on the barriers to scaling hydrogen in emerging markets, and I hope you can see the table on the right. It's a little bit small, but if you were able to download the report, you have better, it's clearer there. Now, one of the main challenges is actually the cost of electricity. Cost of making green hydrogen is largely uneconomical when you compare it with either gray or blue hydrogen. And that's because production cost is from an average of $4.5 to $12 per kilogram compared to gray hydrogen, which is as little as $1 to $2 per kilogram, at least at the time we were putting this report together. And if you look at the breakdown of the production costs, electricity alone, when looking at the total production cost of green hydrogen, consumes more than 60% of the production cost. Then you have the electrolyzer cost absorbing another 35%, and then the balance attributed to O&M. Now, within the production profile of producing green hydrogen, you then have the CAPEX and OPEX components. On the CAPEX side, the choice of your renewable energy generation is going to impact the cost of production. So if it's wind or solar, I mean, they have different costs associated with it. If you do not have access to a stable grid to ensure stable continuous operations, then it means additional investment is required in battery or hydrogen storage systems. So that, of course, will add more cost to the total CAPEX cost. Then the choice of electrolyzer would also impact the total production cost for hydrogen. Different electrolyzer technologies are at different stages of maturity and different costs. So the price of a Chinese alkaline electrolyzer will be different from a European PEM or alkaline electrolyzer. And we're looking at a range of $600 to $2,400 per kilowatt. On the OPEX side, OPEX drivers for green hydrogen production costs. If you go to page 18 of the report, you'll see a detailed breakdown, but basically the prices will depend, electricity prices will depend on the location. Some regions have cheaper renewable energy prices. You'll also see the technology choice for the electrolyzer will impact what the efficiency would look like. It would also, if the electrolyzer has higher efficiency rates, then you're looking at reduced electricity consumption and reduced O&M costs. So all these factors actually play a role in the total cost of production for hydrogen. So 3 key things: the cost of electricity, cost of electrolyzer, which is driven by the choice of technology that you pick for the electrolyzer, as well as O&M, and that in turn will drive the O&M costs. So this slide basically summarizes what we had talked about on the last slide. But again, key takeaway here is that the cost of producing green hydrogen will depend on the region, advancements in technology, manufacturing economies of scale, as well as reductions in renewable energy costs. Now, one good example when this report was put together was Chile. We found out that Chile was among the most competitive markets for green hydrogen, and as such, their projects were able to source electricity at less than 3 cents per kilowatt hour from new solar projects. Now, one thing to note here is that while emerging markets can enjoy cost competitiveness to produce green hydrogen, it's important that we factor in storage costs, transportation costs, in order to deliver this green hydrogen to the demand center. So how do we transport? I mean, what's the most cost competitive way of transporting green hydrogen? Again, on page 18 of the report, there's a summary between the cost competitiveness for shipping and for pipelines. So if the distance is between 1,000 to 4,000 kilometers, then pipelines are considered to be cost effective, but it's going to add about 40 to 50 cents per kilogram of hydrogen, while if the distance goes beyond 4,000 kilometers, then shipping becomes a more effective option. But of course, there are challenges to that, and that has also been addressed in the report. And another challenge for scaling hydrogen that we've seen in emerging markets is the financing cost. A number of factors actually play a role in here. When we had put this report together, we found a weighted average cost of capital for financing green hydrogen projects was from between 6 to 24% or even higher in some markets. And that, of course, depends on the country risk profile. What's the rating of the country? Who are the developers? What's the credit rating of the developer? Their track record? What sort of technology is being utilized? What's the track record of the technology? And are there available subsidies, incentives, or grants in that particular country? Then finally, what does the debt to equity mix look like? So a good example, or one of the projects that was able to successfully secure non-recourse financing, is the NEOM Green Hydrogen project in Saudi. They were able to leverage the abundant solar and wind resources that they had. And the development of this project is actually tied to Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 to build a carbon-free world in the future. Of course, they had indirect subsidies through the state, which is also one of the key factors in ensuring a successful green hydrogen project, of course. But if you look at the data points that's been highlighted here, the development partners are people with investment grade ratings. They had strong support from the government, used a technology with enough number of operating hours, and also the most important factor is they were able to secure a 30-year offtake agreement with an A-rated company, which is Air Products, and they also had a good debt to equity ratio of 70-30. So we thought that was a good example to basically highlight what a sort of successful hydrogen projects would look like. So moving on to chapter 3. In this section, we'll basically talk about the main indicators for assessing a market's readiness for green hydrogen investments. Now, the report essentially recommends 3 pillars for unlocking green hydrogen in emerging markets. First one is having a strong enabling environment, which we'll go into in details in the next slide. The second and third pillars addresses what the supply and demand conditions should look like. But before we go into the pillars, it's important that for countries that are looking to unlock green hydrogen potential in their economies, they first need to understand their role in the global hydrogen market, assess the national priorities, and also the potential to create demand through competitive, scalable supply. So moving on to the first sub-pillar under establishing a strong enabling environment. It's basically having a clear strategy in place. Or maybe just an overview of what the enabling environment means. It basically means having a robust combination of policies, supporting mechanisms, as well as collaborative ecosystems. Now, under this established enabling environment, we broke it down into 4 main characteristics that will define what a strong enabling environment should look like. First one is the strategy. Having a clear strategy that outlines the country's plan to develop a green hydrogen market and also having clear targets. Typically, the development of this strategy will be led by the ministry covering energy affairs. They would sometimes take the lead on developing the strategy independently or with the support from other stakeholders. Defining the strategy, we've posed some guiding questions that could possibly help in crafting what this strategy should look like. And some of these strategies include, some of the guiding questions include countries basically asking themselves if green hydrogen is the best choice for decarbonization amongst the other competing technologies. Is it possible? Shouldn't we consider electrification? If electrification is not the right approach, then is green hydrogen the best choice for decarbonization? What is the desired impact of green hydrogen in the energy transition plan? And is there existing infrastructure that can be leveraged or repurposed? Now, for example, in Turkey, they intend to blend hydrogen into their natural gas pipelines. And also, I think there was a chemical firm in Germany who just retrofitted an old pipeline in order to transport green hydrogen. So this definitely will help in reducing the costs. Now, of course, answers to these questions will vary, but if a clear strategy is backed with infrastructure planning and pre-feasibility studies from the upstream side, then it's definitely going to create attention from the relevant stakeholders, so developers and investors, as well as capital providers. Now, at the time the report was prepared, about 52 countries had released their national hydrogen strategies, more than 20 of them in emerging economies. A lot of the developed countries focused on using green hydrogen for domestic decarbonization, while countries with limited renewable energy resources planned to import from other countries, so countries like Japan, while for emerging markets with abundant renewable energy resources chose the export-oriented path for green hydrogen. Not all countries have clear national hydrogen strategies, but those that do not have basically communicated their ambitions through roadmaps or frameworks or their NDCs or long-term energy plan. A good example is that of the National Green Hydrogen Strategy of Chile again. They basically broke it down into green hydrogen production targets based on number of years, even included electrolyzer targets, investment targets, as well as sales targets across various hard-to-abate industries. The second characteristic of having a good enabling environment is having instruments and mechanisms. We talked about some of the challenges of uptake of green hydrogen in previous slides, access to finance, lack of offtake contracts, high upfront capex. But if there are government-backed investment mechanisms, these could potentially reduce costs, mitigate risks, and also encourage research and development. At the time this research report was put together, we had about $360 billion worth of subsidies to support demand and supply, mainly in North Africa, in the EU, so predominantly Germany and the Netherlands, as well as in Japan. So they had these, they have this $360 billion subsidy in order to incentivize demand in green hydrogen. 61% of the subsidies was to support supply side projects, so to support production of green hydrogen, while less than 5% was basically used for encouraging demand of green hydrogen. That's not to say we don't have emerging markets with incentives. So the first emerging market country or emerging markets with a subsidy program for green hydrogen and its derivatives was India, with about $2 billion to boost green hydrogen supply, which will be paid out over 3 years. In conclusion, incentives could either be in form of tax credits or contracts for difference. So in Egypt, for example, the government in 2024 had passed a new green hydrogen incentive law, which involved tax credits of about 33% to 55%. The mechanism for subsidy amounts is in form of CFDs or contracts for difference, is basically where the government will pay the difference between the strike price and the market price of green hydrogen. So a good example is the H2 Global CFD scheme that was developed in Germany to support both import and export of green hydrogen. Other forms of subsidies could be either through grants and basically to promote research and development. Last two enabling characteristics of establishing an enabling environment, I'll just touch on it briefly. One is regulations and standards. Now, while you have your strategy, which basically addresses the country's ambition for green hydrogen, regulations and standards are required in order to define the rules of the game and basically to ensure fair competition. There is an ongoing regulatory debate largely around emissions intensity. How should emissions be defined, measured, or certified? Regulations around geographic correlation, location of renewable energy production, as well as its timing. Then lastly, on the last characteristic, which is private sector ecosystem, this is basically the collaboration between policymakers and the private sector. And a good example is the World Bank Group Hydrogen for Development Partnership, which was launched in 2022, that is looking to catalyze financing from both private and public sectors. The second pillar that the report elaborates on is on supply conditions. Three main elements to the supply side includes access to renewable energy, infrastructure, availability of infrastructure, so either compress hydrogen, store the hydrogen, or transport the hydrogen, and also the end use applications. Now, going back to the first characteristic, which is access to renewable energy, the renewable energy has to be cheap. Remember on the previous slide when we talked about the portion of electricity cost in the total green hydrogen production cost, electricity alone consumes more than 50% of the green hydrogen production cost. So countries want to try to ensure that they have access to plentiful and consistently available renewable energy in order to maximize the plant's utilization rate, because that gives you more production to spread your capex cost over. Also, if you do not have cheap renewable energy, it could actually make or break the project's bankability, basically. What the research report also, pointed out, or what we found out, is that to meet the net zero scenario by 2030, we need to deploy 3x as much renewable energy as we have today. But also, we have to keep in mind the regulatory environment. Much of the renewable energy required to produce green hydrogen will need to be newly built. But building a new renewable energy just to produce green hydrogen may not always be the best choice, particularly if the country has low energy access or low renewable energy capacity for domestic consumption. So these things have to be balanced. It's not just putting the new renewable energy plants for the purposes of exporting green hydrogen. What does the grid look like? What's the energy access rates in the country? Are there sectors that could be potentially decarbonized before we start exporting green hydrogen? Then the second part is on infrastructure. We're going to need water desalination powered by renewable energy. If fresh water is available, then maybe there's no need for desalination plants. But we also have to keep in mind that we do not want to compete with water for compete with water with the local population. And then lastly, we are going to need ports that are ready and capable to receive and store ammonia. So this is the report touches on one of the has a case study on Brazil and how Brazil was able to meet all the supply conditions, check all the boxes around supply conditions. At the time we prepared the report, Brazil was quoted to be able to produce green hydrogen at less than $2 per kilogram. And that's because they have a lot of the ingredients that we had talked about earlier on, the enabling environment as well as the supply condition. More than 80% of the electricity demand in Brazil is met by renewables, including hydropower. And I guess most of you know Brazil has one of the world's cleanest grids. Hydrogen production in the country is also supported by approved tax incentives as well as a strong regulatory framework. They also have existing domestic industrial demand from fertilizers, sustainable aviation fuel from refineries that could absorb the green hydrogen that is being produced. So there's domestic demand to transition from gray hydrogen to green hydrogen. Then the third pillar, which the report proposes, is on creating strong demand for hydrogen. And this will require a careful mix of incentives. So your carrots, basically, subsidies, taxes, contracts for difference, which I talked about briefly on previous slides, as well as regulations, carbon pricing, as well as emissions caps. Incentives will make the green hydrogen more affordable, while regulations will force buyers to either reduce their emissions or increase their willingness to adopt green hydrogen. Now, when we put this report together, about 27 EU members unanimously adopted the RED directive in order to elevate the share of renewable energy in EU's overall consumption. And then more recently, from the second round of the European Hydrogen Bank auction, it's evident that quotas have started to work. So quotas will fall under the incentives, basically, to offtake green hydrogen. So you see that countries like Germany and the Netherlands, even though their production cost was greater than Portugal or Spain, because they've transposed RED III into their national laws, they have to gradually, they won most of the auctions, but they also have to gradually increase their share of sustainable aviation fuel in jet fuels that is being used in EU airports. So I guess this ladder must look familiar to everyone. This is the famous Michael Liebrecht's ladder. One recommendation is that policymakers prioritize, and this is also in relation to the demand conditions, policymakers should prioritize sectors where demand is real, viable, and enduring. And we've put in Michael Liebrecht's ladder because we feel these sectors that are viable are best represented, or the sectors that have the best demand conditions are better represented on this ladder. So first, if you look at A on the left, these are sectors where hydrogen is already in use, as hydrogen is used as feedstock in refining, in ammonia, in methanol. Green hydrogen can replace the gray hydrogen that is being used in these sectors with limited disruption, basically. Second will be sectors with fewer or no alternatives. So those with high temperature industrial heat, shipping, fuels. And then the third one will be industries facing regulations or that have regulations imposed on them. Carbon pricing has already been put in place in these sectors. And then you go down the ladder to, of course, you wouldn't want to go to the sectors that are not competitive. Then moving on, so we've covered the market conditions for creating or for considering market readiness. The next section will look at project level considerations for green hydrogen. So this is going to cover a wide range of considerations, but it's important to balance and understand what the risks and opportunities are associated with this. So first one is on, and this is not exhaustive, this is just a representation of what will be considered at the project level. First one is on technical. The considerations will basically range from choosing the most suitable hydrogen production method, storage technology, as well as storage technology and utilization technology based on resource availability, scale of operations, as well as end-use requirements. Other factors to consider would include the readiness of the infrastructure, such as the readiness of the ports, pipelines. Are there existing pipelines that can be retrofitted, or do we have to build new pipelines? Are there refueling stations? What is the storage facility? What does the grid look like? Do we have to put storage in place, or can we rely on the grid to provide continuous electricity supply? On the electrolyzer side, we basically, or the developer will need to understand the relationship between the current density and minimum load. How do you compensate for low stack level flexibility, for example? Then moving on to the economic considerations, here you're trying to understand the financial viability of the project, understanding the CapEx, the OpEx, the revenue streams, project financing from public and private sources, as well as the broader market conditions and cost competitiveness of your green hydrogen. What is the market demand looking like? Who is the off-taker? What's the pricing going to be? And more importantly, what's the development impact? How many jobs will be created from this hydrogen project? Then the third consideration will be the environmental consideration. The report goes, I won't talk a lot about the environmental and regulatory considerations because the report actually goes in depth into these. But on the environmental consideration, it just basically looking at the life cycle analysis, what's the carbon footprint of the project. So this involves assessing the environmental impact of the hydrogen production method, including the greenhouse gas emissions as well as water consumption. On the regulatory side, it's important to basically understand the regulatory landscape governing the production, transportation, as well as the use of hydrogen. So an example will be, what is the permitting and licensing environment? What does it look like? What will be the impact of permitting timelines on the project? How do we secure the necessary permits for development, construction, and operations? Again, understanding the timelines for securing permitting and also what regulation, when is the COD how does it tie to the regulation of markets that you're trying to export to? And then lastly, offtake. But offtake is one of the economic considerations which will be covered in another slide. So we tried to put some project funding sources for potential green hydrogen projects. Multiple funding sources will be required from public, private, as well as blended finance mechanisms. However, beyond direct project finance, we feel that governments can stimulate green hydrogen activities through grants and subsidies, and that's tied to, if you remember, the first pillar, creating an enabling environment. Second funding source is going to be PPPs, so public-private partnerships, which we've broken down into two. So collaborative initiatives, which are basically partnerships to jointly fund and develop hydrogen projects. And an example of this is the Green Hydrogen Catapult, which was launched in 2020 by the UN and supported by RMI to accelerate the adoption of green hydrogen and bring the cost of green hydrogen to below $2 per kilogram by 2026. Within the PPP funding source as well is the co-investment model, which is where both public and private sector partners come together to share project costs, risks, as well as the reward. And an example of this is the Hyphen Hydrogen project, which is a partnership between Enetrag, a private company, and the Namibian government. And finally, the ones that most people know is just direct project finance, which will be backed by long-term offtake contracts. So it's either debts or equity financing. And then moving on to the next slide, which is on the offtake contract. So I've talked about offtake on multiple slides. Securing long-term offtake contracts has remained a major obstacle for financing green hydrogen projects, although they've been trickling in slowly. And I think there was a recent one that was signed, a 15-year offtake contract between Total Energy and RWE. So it's coming, but it's trickling in. There are a couple of conditions for bankable offtakes, and we've tried to touch on a couple of them on this slide, but you'll see, I think, a lot more in the report. One is on the creditworthiness of the offtaker. Having investment grade rated offtakers essentially enhances the project viability, because it means that these investment grade rated offtakers have it's considered that they have a strong ability to meet their financial obligations. So if you look at the examples of offtake agreements that I talked about, Air Products in the NEOM project is in the NEOM Saudi Arabia project is rated A. Same thing with Total Energy. They're both rated A by S&P. Second condition for bankable offtake is the quality and quantity. The offtake agreement should typically specify what the technical specifications and standards for the green hydrogen should be to avoid any ambiguity. Different standards have different definitions and measurements, and also measurement basis for hydrogen, green ammonia, methanol, and methane. And also different standards have different ways on how they calculate emissions. So it's always good to be clear of which standard is being followed in the particular offtake agreement. And of course, include the quantity and inspection protocols. The third condition for bankable offtake is having a predictable revenue stream, and that's through having a take-or-pay provision in your offtake contract. You also want flexibility in the agreement to address technical issues like reduced plant availability, liquidated damages for underperformance, but even the buyers, in the event the off-taker's facility is not ready to receive the hydrogen, who's going to be responsible? Fourth condition for bankable offtake is on the pricing mechanism. Pricing can either be fixed or over the tenure of the offtake contract or linked to an index. And an example of the index that could be linked in the hydrogen purchase contract is the inflation index. And then last but not least is the tenure and termination. This is one of the bankable conditions for an offtake contract. Offtake agreements should, of course, include what the events of defaults are, what are the termination events, force majeure events, and what even happens when force majeure events are extended over a particular period of time. On tenure, the duration, the tenure of the offtake contract, ideally it will be good to have the duration aligned with the project life cycle. And also, finally, what are the conditions for early termination in the offtake agreement? Okay. And then finally, we get to the end of the present monologue. So I will pass on to Ignacio for his summary and wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. So look, hopefully you can all take some time to have a look at the report, and I think Margaret has touched, I think, on some of those key points that we wanted to highlight. I think we all agree that this industry isn't going to be taking off, at least not at the pace that we need it, without strong government support and regulation. I think it would be naive to think that the private sector can do it alone based on just private sector sort of incentives, and therefore, we are very encouraged that after quite a slow start, you could argue from the regulatory perspective, and quite a bit of confusion and lack of clarity, things are starting to be clarified, at least in certain regions. EU notably, I think we're very encouraged by some of the clarifications that and sort of transposition of some of RED 3 into some national legislation. It's far from perfect, and we think there's obviously a lot of risk, as Margaret says, in the current environment. And we are seeing certain governments sort of backtrack on certain sort of items and things, but nonetheless, there at least is progress. We are seeing, from our perspective, private sector players starting to respond to some of those mandates and incentives coming in. We are seeing, for example, fuel providers to European airports starting to really scramble to secure sources of ESAF based on the very significant penalties that they are anticipating coming in if they do not meet those the required quotas. Similarly, on the maritime fuel perspective, we're also starting to see more and more interest in trying to secure some of those volumes that are required under the EU legislation. So I think that is all very very positive. In terms of investment mechanisms, incentives, it is good to see the results of the auctions. I think the amounts are not huge typically. They are not insignificant, but they're not huge relative to the challenge that we have. But what these auctions are allowing us to do is to start clearing prices and getting more clarity on prices. I think one of the key issues in this industry in these early stages is the lack of transparency or clarity in terms of what real costs are, what the issues are, etc., including, for example, on the technical side, how electrolyzers are actually working, what are the issues that are being faced by those initial large-scale electrolyzer projects. And so, these are the natural teething issues, we think, of the industry. We are happy that some of the hype has actually descended, because it does, I think, focus the minds on tangible things that are required to make the industry happen, and we're not having, you know, hundreds and hundreds of gigawatts announced every 2 days. So we do think that is very encouraging. I think from IFC's perspective, and this is the fourth bubble on the financing and de-risking solutions. You know, Margaret mentioned NEOM. And NEOM was quite an extraordinary project in many regards in terms of how it was put together and financed. You know, it had all the bells and whistles, or belt and braces, whatever you want to call it, in terms of off-taker, in terms of, you know, EPC contract, in terms of support from the Saudi government, etc., etc. But I think in many of the other projects that we're going to be seeing coming to project financing, and that we are seeing coming to project financing, it will take a bit of a leap of faith from financiers to lend to these initial projects. There are risks, regulatory risks, technical risks, commercial risks, etc., which you can try to mitigate as well as you can, but they aren't going to be perfectly mitigated. And we've seen that in certain other industries, including back in the solar industry, where there was renegotiation of contracts, and, you know, after projects happened back in Spain, etc., etc. So, you know, I think we are cautiously optimistic, but it will take a lot of faith and perseverance from both regulators, governments, and financiers and others. So with that, I will hand it back, I don't know, to Margaret or Dolph, in case we want to.
I think it's
questions. Dolph, over to you.
So Margaret, Ignacio, thank you very much for that very enlightening overview of what the report contains. And as I said, I think this will also be very helpful in a 10 gigawatt Lighthouse Initiative context. So I think we should also discuss it there. With that, we are exactly on time now for the Q&A session. So I would say there are already some questions also in the Q&A in the Teams, but I also want to open it up for the floor. Are there any immediate questions? And I'm trying to see, I'm doing this on my phone, how I can see if there's any raised hands. Let's see. But maybe we can start for now with the questions in the Q&A. Does the report contain some specifications on products that have more acceptance or that are widely accepted?
So I think that information is just coming out now. I mean, the report tries to talk about what will be expected. Sorry, I'm still sharing my screen. So again, we touched on the certification programs that will guide the quality of products, basically. And we also touched on the mandatory EU regulations for green hydrogen production, basically. So that's contained in the report.
Very good. I can't see. Are there any raised hands? Or does anybody want to speak up on the questions? If not, I put.
I mean, I can go to Laurent's question.
Okay.
On sub-Saharan Africa. I think on the green hydrogen for sub-Saharan Africa. So look, I think from an IFC's perspective, we are being very selective and very cautious on export-oriented projects. We are supporting a few, but given the size of the current demand, one has to be very, very cautious about projects that are relying exclusively on export. You know, in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, it has long-term potential for exports, but really long-term. with the exception of a few big, your projects and countries which we think are well positioned. I think what sub-Saharan Africa does have, which is actually not dissimilar to maybe places like Brazil or even you could argue India, certain sub-Saharan countries have cheap, abundant renewable energy resources, hydro in particular in more parts of Central Africa, but solar and wind in other parts. Some African countries do not have domestic oil and gas resources. There are some that do and have abundant, but some of them don't. And yet all of them need fertilizers for their local agricultural consumption. And that fertilizer can be actually quite expensive because it is typically imported fertilizer with significant logistics costs to get to the areas that it has to get to. So we do feel that there are places in sub-Saharan Africa that can potentially actually create cheaper green fertilizer than imported grey fertilizer. Now there is some complexity around subsidies for fertilizers, etc. But from an economic perspective, there is potential, particularly when these are countries that already have excess hydro capacity, thinking of the Angolas of this world and potentially even Uganda, etc. So we think that's sort of one example of where sub-Saharan Africa has an opportunity. And there are actually, there are obviously countries like South Africa that do have also an iron ore industry, other types of industries that could also be domestic off-takers. And those are industries that have export dollar revenues and going into Europe. So again, that's another linkage, I think, where you can anchor domestic demand in Africa. So both in the agricultural sector through fertilizers, as well as the industrial sector, particularly connected to mining, iron ore, etc. So we do feel that there is that potential in sub-Saharan Africa as well.
There's a new question coming in. Are we seeing subsidies to support development of green hydrogen projects prior to construction? So DevEx type of subsidies, development subsidies.
There are a few institutions. I mean, I think the P2X platform, Dolph. I mean, they have been supporting a few projects in sort of DevEx. We have been seeing relatively small pockets of other monies from different entities supporting DevEx. I think the question is, DevEx costs can be significant, particularly for the very large projects. You could be running into $50 to $100 billion of DevEx for some of the larger projects. And there it's always going to be a big challenge to find sufficient amount of subsidies to make a dent in that very large DevEx number.
Very good. I wanted now to also bring in Megan Meyer. Megan is the lead in ESMAP for our industrial decarbonization program. And in that program, I mean, hydrogen is a key decarbonization option for a number of industries, as Margaret also explained. So Megan, you want to come in with your perspective and take over the discussion from here, please.
Very much, Dolph. First of all, thank you very much to Margaret and Ignacio for this very interesting, comprehensive presentation. Also, thank you to H4D and all of its partners for organizing this event and many others. I think this knowledge exchange and information sharing is critical to help build capacity and also gain consensus amongst key stakeholders in how we can advance this agenda, including in emerging market and developing countries. So thank you very much again to our panelists. I think the report was really comprehensive, outlining some of the key challenges. I won't go through them all, but some of them that stick out in my mind, of course, are the importance of the enabling environment that Margaret described in quite a bit of detail, including things like certification and sufficient government support, including incentives, which we see an increasing amount happening in developing countries. The importance of renewable energy in driving the final cost per ton of green hydrogen. And I think another point that's quite important and that was raised here was the importance of grid access and transmission, because we're seeing in our engagement with a number of developing countries that even ones that have really sophisticated power systems planning, that this issue of the requirements for additional transmission have been underestimated and are now becoming roadblocks in moving these projects forward. There's some of these hidden costs associated with green hydrogen projects that I think are coming more up on the radar. And these also create trade-offs, because who bears the cost of all these additional investments? And I think Margaret also raised another issue around trade-offs in terms of, do you have sufficient access to electricity already in the country? And what are the other uses of renewable energy in terms of meeting countries' objectives to decarbonize their grid? So all of these complicated things have to be taken into consideration in engaging with countries. And I liked, Margaret, your question, the outlining of the questions, guidance points for countries and how they can start thinking about some of these complicated issues. But at the same time, there's a lot of excellent opportunities that we're seeing emerge. This increase in incentives and enabling environment in developing countries. Also, some regulated demand now coming from the aviation and maritime sector, as Ignacio alluded to, helping to ensure there'll be some demand that can absorb these higher prices that are currently in the market today, as well as opportunities for creating domestic offtake. And Ignacio really heard your point about IFC's view that looking for these projects that have domestic offtake is critical in helping to get the market started. And we also think that's a critical part of the development agenda, helping countries identify where they can utilize, produce green hydrogen, use it for their domestic industries, and then be able to enter into new green value chains to create new opportunities for economic growth. So we're very committed, the World Bank Group, World Bank and IFC and MIGA, in working with our client countries and other global partners to advance this agenda. I just wanted to highlight two examples that are relevant to the presentation made today by Margaret and Ignacio. One is in India. The World Bank has been working very closely with the government, providing technical assistance as well as development policy lending, which helped to establish their national green hydrogen mission and to put in place these pretty significant public incentives. I think you mentioned $2 billion to help both on the supply and demand side and getting this market started. And then in Brazil, working closely alongside Ignacio and other IFC colleagues in preparing investment operations, one in the northeast of Brazil, looking to support this common use infrastructure in the port of Pecém, which is going to be the location of a green hydrogen hub. So helping that shared infrastructure piece that was mentioned, as well as developing new financial intermediary operations with both national and regional development banks in Brazil that can help on lend and provide concessional support to bring down the cost of financing and improve the viability of these projects. Lastly, just want to mention again the work with IFC and other partners, I'm sure on this call, on the 10 gigawatt, as Dolph mentioned. This is really key, and we're hoping to continue advancing this to bring some projects, 10 gigawatts of green hydrogen to FID. So with that, I'll close. Really, again, thank you, IFC panelists. Thank you for the audience for your joining and your engaging questions. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day.